Welcome to the Daisy Frock tutorial. Seam allowance is included in the pattern and is 1/2 inch or 1.3 centimeters everywhere unless otherwise mentioned. And I am sewing a size 8 in a cotton quilting for style A and a cotton eyelet for style B with cotton voile linings. There are two styles of the Daisy Frock. Only the bodices are constructed differently, so the instructions are combined in this one video. Style A has spaghetti straps, and you will cut out pieces 1 to 7 for this style. Also make sure that you cut the style A bodice armhole with the notched strap openings, as shown here. Style B has sleeves, and you will cut out pieces 1 to 3 and 5 to 9. And make sure you cut the style B bodice armhole with the smooth armhole curve to accommodate those sleeves. There will always be a caption above indicating which style or styles the current instructions pertain to, as well as chapter titles and my voice prompts. Now let's get sewing. For both styles, make sure you mark the neckline and waistline buttonholes on the front main bodice piece. Do it on both the right and wrong side of the piece. Then on the wrong side, you'll know where to place the fusible interfacing rectangles, which are 2 by 1 inch or 5 by 2 centimeters in dimension. Center these over the buttonhole markings and press in place. This adds bulk for your buttonhole. Also, make sure you mark all the lines for the 3 waist elastic channels on the right side of both the lining bodice pieces. We are moving forward now with style A bodice and spaghetti strap construction. Skip to the style B chapter if you're working on style B. Sew the 4 1/2 inch or 1.3 centimeter wide buttonholes where marked on the right side of the front bodice main. And don't forget to cut open these buttonholes. Fold the top edge of the front and back bodice strap openings 1/2 inch or 1.3 centimeters to the wrong side of the piece and sew at 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter. Do the same for the front and back lining pieces. The wrong side of the lining would be the side that you didn't mark the elastic channel lines. Place the front and back bodice main right sides together and sew at the side seams. Then open the seam and stitch each seam down 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter away from each seam. Repeat for the front and back lining, but on one side, leave a gap unsewn between the top and bottommost elastic channel notches. And make sure you backstitch on both sides of that opening. You may want to press this seam before stitching each side down. Stitching the seams down allow for smoother insertion of the elastics later. And there you can see my neatly sewn side seams. Place the bodice main and lining right sides together and pin along the neckline and then stitch together. Then you're going to turn out and understitch. To understitch, you're going to fold the seam allowance towards the lining and stitch close to the seam. Once this is done, turn inside out again and pin each armhole and then stitch. Then you can trim this seam. Also, you should cut a couple snips at the curve of the seam, which I didn't initially do. Then you can turn this out. And just a reminder that unless I mention otherwise, the seam allowance that you are sewing with is 1/2 inch or 1 centimeter everywhere. Next, once everything is turned out, Press the armholes and necklines, and this is where I went in and snipped a couple of snips along the sharp armhole curve so that everything sits much flatter. Now this part may seem tricky, but it's really quite simple. We're going to finish the hem through that lining gap. After testing feedback, I decided to refilm this step to include more detail for you. That's why I'm using a different fabric. We are going to use the lining gap to turn everything to the inside so that we can sew the hem in one fell swoop. To get this started, fold in the main and lining hems so that they are right sides together and grab this through that lining gap. This just gets the seam started and you want to pin this in place. Continue to pull out the hem from that gap in one direction and pin for a good 10 inches or so. This just sets everything up to be properly aligned when we turn this inside out. So then after pinning a good section, just pull everything through the lining gap. This will allow you to more easily access the hem to continue to place it right sides together and pin it together. And make sure as you do this that you line up the center notches and the side seams. Once you have arrived back where you've started, you can take it to the machine to sew at that regular 1/2 inch or 1.3 centimeter seam allowance. I'm doing sort of a wide shot for you so that you can see how this works. Essentially what we have here is a sort of donut shape happening with this construction. Once this is done, you will be able to put your hand through to the other side. And this is how it's going to be as you sew up the hem. So start at a seam and sew at that 1/2 inch or 1.3 centimeter seam allowance. As you sew, just keep pulling the hem out and stitching along until you finally reach where you started. And again, as I said, you'll be able to put your hand through the center. Now find that lining gap and just turn everything right side out slowly through that gap. And that completes your clean finished hem. Back to our original sample, we are just going to take it to the iron and press that hem. If you can't seem to wrap your mind around this clean finishing method, simply fold in the hems of the main and lining at a 1/2 inch or 1.3 centimeters, press in place from the outside, and then just stitch the folds together. Now on the right sides of both back and front, sew 3/4 of an inch or 1.9 centimeters away from the neckline edge. Then sew 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter from the first stitch line further into the body. The buttonholes should be centered between these lines. This is the ruffle and channel for the shoulder straps. Next, we're going to turn inside to the lining and we're going to sew along all of those 1/2 inch or 1.3 centimeter wide markings for the waist elastic channels, keeping the lining gap accessible for elastic insertion later. So once you're done, you can see that all these channels have open access via our gap for the elastics. You really only need the top two for this purpose, as the bottom channel is fed through from the outer buttonholes, but we sewed the gap that big so that we'd be able to get to the hem. And also, when you sew channel D, the waist channel, make sure that the buttonholes on the front are centered between the stitches. And just a note, if you want this to be just a blouse, all you have to do to finish is add in the elastics and ties at this point. However, do not add in the elastics and ties if you're going to continue to add the skirt to this dress, as it will make it very difficult for you to finish. Take your waist ties and shoulder straps, piece 3 and 4, and cut them down the center to create 2 each. I do this by first folding and ironing them in half, and then cutting carefully along the fold. Next, you're going to fold the sides of the straps towards the center and press in place. You can use a bias tape maker, but I find it so easy just to use my hands, especially with stiffer cotton like this. You also want to fold in one end about 1/4 inch, just to have one end finished, and then fold everything again lengthwise so that no raw edges are showing. Some of the pattern testers used ribbon instead of creating their own straps, which I think is a genius way that can save you some time and look really cute. Next, sew down the folded edge of the strap, and I like to use a little piece of tracing paper. Any light piece of paper will do to get the stitch started, as there's not a lot of surface area on this piece of fabric, so it really helps with the back stitching and moving forward. For the shoulder straps, piece 4, and waist ties, piece 3, find the corresponding elastic length according to your size in the Style A elastic channel chart. And you'll find this in the Read First file on page 9, and cut to length. Piece 4 attaches to Style A Channel A elastic, and piece 3 attaches to Style A Channel D elastic. That's the waistline elastic. Then you're going to overlap the raw ends of each strap to the raw ends of the elastics, overlap it by about 5/8 of an inch or 1.6 centimeters, and then just pin them together. And we're going to sew a straight stitch back and forth lengthwise, and that will make it very secure. And do not feed anything into the channels on the bodice, because we're going to do that later. So we have completed Style A instructions for the bodice. Now I will instruct on the Style B bodice. To continue with Style A, skip to the Style A-B chapter. We are now continuing with the Style B bodice and sleeve construction. As mentioned before, Style B has the sleeves, so be sure you cut out the smooth, curved armhole line to accommodate those sleeves. Start by taking your front bodice piece, the main piece, and stitch the waist seam buttonholes, only the waist seam buttonholes. I've already sewn together the front and back bodice main, right sides together, and sewn flat each side seam. For the lining, do the exact same, but make sure that you leave a gap between the top and bottommost notch on one side. Next, we're going to place the bodice, main and lining right sides together and stitch along the hemline. And we're going to turn out and press. With wrong sides together, stitch both layers of the main and lining at the neckline and armholes, just a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters to keep everything together and in place. Then you're going to sew the neckline buttonholes, where marked, through both the main and lining. This is very important because later we are going to sew a bias binding along the neckline, and therefore the channel will not be between the main and lining of the bodice. Then make sure you open your buttonholes. Moving on to the sleeve. I want to note that I'm adding a layer of cotton voile to the sleeves since the fabric is a transparent eyelet. However, there is no lining included in the pattern other than the bodice lining. So if you need to do this because you have thin fabric, you need to make sure that you purchase more lining fabric. So I'm just layering the same piece together and treating it as if it's one piece. You're going to mark the elastic and fold lines on the right side of the sleeve with disappearing marker or chalk. Then we're going to fold according to the instructions on the sleeve pattern. So fold the first line, right sides together. Fold line 2, wrong sides together. And line 3, again, wrong sides together. And of course, we're going to take it to the iron and press everything in place. And we are going to tuck the raw end under the first fold on the wrong side to make everything very clean and concealed. And then we're just going to pin along that inner fold. And also, this is how it looks from the side view. So now that it's all pinned, you're going to sew your first stitch along this inner fold. And then you're going to stitch another line 1/2 inch or 13 millimeters towards the top of the sleeve. This will create the elastic channel, and when you turn it over, you'll realize that now we have a beautiful double hem ruffle on the sleeve. Next, we're going to cut our elastics according to the sleeve bicep channel E row in the Style B elastic chart, and make sure you choose the correct size. Or to be more accurate, you can just measure your bicep and reduce that measurement by 1 to 2 inches or 2.5 to 5 centimeters and feed that in. And then you can always try it on and see if you want to tighten it or make the elastic bigger. I actually found that because my sleeve was so bulky, I actually needed to reduce the elastic length quite a bit to have it where I wanted. Once you are happy with it, secure the elastic at the side seams with a stitch. And then you're going to overlock or zigzag the side seams of the sleeve to finish it. I like to use a small crochet hook to pull the overlocked tails through the stitch. It makes it really nice and neat. Next, place the side seams of the sleeve right sides together and sew. To create a really neat hem at the seam of the sleeve, fold in the bottom edges of the seam allowance and stitch down in a triangle formation. Next, locate the notches on your sleeve at the armhole area. The single notch applies to the front and the double notch to the back. You can't really get it wrong though. The back armhole is about an inch longer than the front. Apply the sleeves to the armhole from notch to notch and pin in place. And then sew from end to end. And when I overlock, I'm trimming the seam allowance down to 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters. If you're using a zigzag stitch to finish the raw edges, simply trim it down first and then stitch. Then you can fold the seam allowance of the sleeve towards the sleeve. I didn't do this, but you can top stitch it down to make it easier to feed in the neckline ties later. And the sleeves have the added lining, as I mentioned, it's not part of the pattern, so I also had to stitch them together along the cap of the sleeve just to keep the two layers together. Moving on to our neckline bias binding. So first mark the center of one of the 3 pieces of your bias tape. Connect the other 2 pieces of the bias tape to the center piece at a right angle on each end. And sew from the top inner corner to the bottom outer corners on each side to create a continuous strip of bias tape. Once you sew it, this is how it should look. Trim those seams and then press these seams open. And then you're going to fold in 1/2 inch or 1.3 centimeters to the wrong side along the length of the bias tape and press it. And then we're going to place the unfolded side of the bias binding right sides together to the neckline of the bodice. The center notch should align at the center front bodice notch. Pin along the entire neckline, and when you get to the sleeves, make sure you ever so slightly stretch the bias tape. It'll make it so much easier sewing the inner fold to the sleeve later. I actually gave it a lot of slack because I wasn't really thinking, and you'll see later how it made it quite puckered because I had to ease everything in, and then it just got more puckered from there. Luckily, it's not a part that's seen, and also it's gathered so you won't ever be able to tell that it's puckered, but it's nice to sew something super clean and lovely, so just take my tip to ever so slightly stretch that bias tape along the sleeve cap. Don't stretch it along the neckline though, because that's a different type of curve and we don't want it tight there. When you get to the center back, you're going to want to connect the ends of the bias tape together, either straight across, which is the easiest way, or at the same diagonal as the other seams. Sewing it at a diagonal creates less bulk, so I'm opting for this option. To do this, I'll arrange it to match at the diagonal, press it with the iron to mark the stitch line, and then I open this, line it up, and stitch it together. Then trim that seam and press it open and continue pinning it along the neckline. and now it's ready to sew along the entire neckline. When I sewed it, I sewed with the bias tape side down, since bias tape is inherently stretchy, so allowing the feed dogs to ease it in and keep everything in place as I sew is a really good idea, as opposed to letting the foot push it forward as you sew if it was on the top. Once this is done, you're going to turn it out and understitch. And then you can trim off about 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters. Next, we're going to stitch along the inner fold of the bias tape. So fold it into the neckline and pin all along the neckline. Next, we're going to stitch along the edge of the inner fold of the bias tape. Make sure everything's laying flat. It's good to press this down first. Now we come to the cap of the sleeve, and you see just how much I have to ease in because I didn't slightly stretch the bias tape in this area. I was able to ease it in okay, but it definitely had a lot of puckers happening. So take a lesson from me and do it the right way. After you stitch your first stitch, you're going to stitch 1/2 inch or 1.3 centimeters away from the first stitch to create the elastic neckline channel. Now we're going to turn to the inside of the bodice where the lining shows and all of those elastic guidelines are, and we're going to sew along all of these 1/2 inch or 1.3 centimeter wide markings for the waist elastic channels. So once you're done, you can see that all the channels have open access via our gap for the elastics. Moving on to the shoulder and waist ties. So for style B, both the neck ties and the waist ties are cut from piece 3. So take both of these pieces and cut down the center to create 2 each. Next, fold in one short end of each piece. Then fold each side to the center lengthwise. Then fold everything again lengthwise so that no raw edges are showing. Sew down the folded edge of the strap, and I like to use a small piece of lightweight paper to get things started smoothly. Since there's so little surface area to be moved by the feed dogs below, some of the pattern testers used ribbon instead of creating their own straps, which I think is a genius way that can save you some time and look really cute. Next, find the corresponding elastic length according to your size in the elastic chart, and you can find this in the Read First file on page 11 for style B. Overlap the raw ends of each strap to the ends of the corresponding elastic by 5/8 of an inch or 1.6 centimeters, and then you can pin these together, bring it to the machine and sew a straight stitch lengthwise, back and forth a couple of times just to have everything very secure. And then set these aside to feed in later. The following steps are for finishing both style A and B. Most of these steps will be shown in the green quilting cotton, which is my style A sample, with some appearances of the white style B sample for clarification on style B. So we are going to continue with constructing the skirt for style A and B. So you want to pre-fold and press up the hems of the front and back skirt pieces, 1/2 inch or 1.3 centimeters first, and then 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters, according to those notches on the side seam. Next, you're going to overlock or zigzag the top and sides of the skirt edges and all 4 pocket bag edges. And I also want to mention that I added a lining to my style B skirt because of the transparent nature of the fabric I chose. This is not a part of the pattern, but if you do find that you want to line your skirt, simply cut out the same pattern piece in your lining fabric, but cut it a few inches shorter, and then lay it on the wrong side of your main skirt. You also want to have the hem of that lining finished. You can fold it up twice, 1/2 inch or 1.3 centimeters, and then you can overlock these two pieces together and treat it as if it's one skirt piece. Place your pocket bags right sides together at the skirt notches and sew at 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter. Then understitch the pocket bag. Then place your front and back skirt right side together and then sew from the waist to the top of the pocket bag, sew around the pocket bag until you get to the skirt again, and then pivot and sew down to the hem. And we're sewing with our regular 1/2 inch or 1.3 centimeter seam allowance. Also, note that the back skirt is narrower than the front skirt. This was to allow for more gathering in the front bodice area. Now that our side seams are done, press the pocket bag toward the front skirt, snipping the back seam allowance to press open the side seams above and below the pocket. Then we're going to finish our hem, fold it where we had pre-folded it before, the 1/2 inch then 1 inch, and then sew along the inner fold to finish. And now with the wrong side of the skirt and bodice facing out, and making sure that the fronts are facing you, overlap the skirt waist edge 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters past the top stitch line of the waistline channel or channel D. Pin this in place, matching the centers and the side seams, and then stitch through the channel D stitches through to the skirt to secure the skirt to the bodice. When you get this into the machine, make sure that skirt is aligned over the top channel D stitch line. And then, as I said, you're going to sew over both the channel D stitch lines. And just keep checking as you sew that everything is aligned. And make sure you don't make the channel narrower as you sew. Sew directly over those original stitches or a hair outside of the channel stitches. So as you can see here, I have sewn both channel stitches through the skirt waist, and it is now ready for us to feed in all the elastics and straps. For the style A neckline, feed through the elasticated shoulder strap ties through the back neckline channel and center it, ensuring that the straps are the same length on each side. Then feed the remaining strap through the front shoulder area and out each buttonhole at the center front. Gather the front bodice along these straps and you can adjust when wearing it. For the style B neckline, we're going to feed the elasticated neckline tie through one buttonhole, get it all through the sleeve cap, the back, the other sleeve cap, and then out the other buttonhole. So for both A and B, find the elastic lengths for channel B and C. They're the same in both elastic charts. In the Read First file on page 9 and 11, cut your 1/4 inch or 6mm wide elastic pieces to these lengths, and then feed these through channel B and C. And you're going to feed it from the inside openings of the bodice lining. Once you come out the other side, you're going to overlap the ends by 5/8 of an inch or 1.6 centimeters, and then pin in place. And then we're going to feed the next channel elastic through. We're also going to overlap those ends and pin them together, and now they are ready to sew. I like to sew a straight stitch back and forth a couple of times on the elastic. I get it into the machine, get the needle in before moving the pin entirely, and then just carefully backstitch. If you find this a bit tricky, you could also hand baste it together first. And then you're going to pull your elastics inside each channel, stretching the elastic to disperse the gathers evenly in the bodice waist. And just note, these channels will always have these openings on the inside, so if one day you want to tighten or replace these elastics, you'll be able to do it very easily without the use of a seam ripper. Next, we're going to feed in the waist tie elastic assembly, starting through one buttonhole at the waist and ending out the second buttonhole. And that is exactly the same for style A and B. And that completes your style A and style B daisy frock. Be sure to share your make with me on Instagram using my hashtag daisyfrock, and also tag me at Lydia Naomi Studio so that I can see and share it. Thanks so much for watching.